Hi, and welcome to Books in Action. My name is Larry Petraccaro, and I'm here with my co-host Keisha Miller from the South Orange Public Library. And we are lucky to have as our guest tonight Marc Aronson. Marc is an author who lives here in Maplewood. He's written a number of things which we're going to talk about, but we're going to start talking about his latest story, which is young adult, but it's young adult nonfiction, and it's called Rising Water. And for those of you that remember, it's about the rescue of the 12, I guess it was 12 boys in Thailand who got trapped in a cave during the monsoon season. So we're going to start with that, and then if we have the opportunity, we'll talk a little bit more generally about young adult literature. So Keisha, why don't I turn this over to you for now?
Thank you, Larry. Good evening, Marc. Thank you for joining us. So Rising Water, the story of the Thai cave rescue, just as Larry mentioned earlier, what inspired you to write this book?
Well, this summer, I was with my family actually hiking in the Swiss Alps. We were there because one of my earliest friends is now a geologist, and he was going to show my youngest son the exact place where the European tectonic plate had smashed, the African tectonic plate had smashed into the European tectonic plate millions of years ago, creating the Alps. So he was taking us all along, showing us reading the stones as we walked through the Alps. But each day, at the end of the day, we would hike down the mountain to this kind of hut where there was the tiniest bit of Wi-Fi. And I had been following the story of the boys trapped in the cave, and I knew it was a very dramatic and intense story. But on the day that they were finally fully rescued, there was an article in the New York Times which explained something of the background of the boys and something of the very difficult lives they were leading before all this happened. And it really struck me because, as it turns out, this cave rescue took place in the far north of Thailand, where Thailand has a very porous border with Laos and Burma. And a lot of people slip across the border because Thailand is wealthier than its neighbors, and people bring their children for better lives there. So a quarter of the boys in the cave and 35% of the boys in the larger soccer team of which they were a part are what's called stateless. Stateless means it's like undocumented plus.
Right.
Because not only are they not legally in Thailand, they have no papers from anywhere else. They are like, if you remember the old movies, or the old book, is A Man Without a Country. They have no country status, and that makes them extremely vulnerable in Thailand to any police person who might ask for their papers. They can never get married. They can never leave the country and return. And so they're subject to a great deal of prejudice. And so the fact that the entire world came together to save the very kinds of people who precisely at that moment our president was separating from their parents at our border, to me that was a story that had to be told. There was all the drama and adventure, and it's full of that, of what actually happened and heroism. But there was a larger story about internationalism. And one of the great things about the process of writing the book is that I came to learn that the rescuers felt it at the time. They had a strong sense that this was the world working together at a time where so much of the world is involved in sealing in and blocking and rejecting. And we'll come to it a bit later, but it turned out that this story of the stateless is absolutely at the heart of how the boys were rescued, and so it's a book I had to write.
Interesting. So you talked about what inspired you, but what are some of the, and I'm sure there was much that you learned in the process of writing it. What are some of the challenges that were presented?
Well, the most immediate and initial challenge I faced, well, one, my publisher wanted me to write it quickly, so I knew I had to get a lot of information. But the other challenge was that the information I had available to me was in English. I could get articles from the New York Times, from the Wall Street Journal, from BBC, The Guardian. I had a wide variety of, there are papers published in Singapore in English. So I had a variety of points of view, but I don't read Thai. And so I immediately needed to hire 3 Thai readers to gather information from Thai TV, from Thai press, and Thai social media. And that was only the beginning, because it soon became clear to me that other countries played a huge role there, in particular China. And so I hired a Chinese reader to, again, read not merely official publications, but to correspond with, and I did manage to correspond with the Chinese rescuers. I hired a person who reads Japanese, because the Japanese played an important role. So I now was starting to look at this rescue not just through the narrow lens of what we see in our feeds every day or in print, if you read the paper in print, but really globally.
Right.
And then I would add there was one other crucial voice, which is more accessible to us, but it takes digging, which is to say the American military played actually a quite wonderful role in the rescue, but they have their own ways of releasing information that I had to become part of. So it was a matter of figuring out who has the information I will need to tell this story in 3 dimensions.
That's awesome. I mean, that's wonderful. So, in comparison to your other published works, what are some of the similarities that...
Well, the most immediate similarity is that several years ago, when the 33 miners were trapped in the mine in Chile, I was asked to write a book relatively quickly about it, and I did. And it's the same publisher. And so I knew that I could do it. And I knew that I knew sort of what I would need to do to do a book like this, especially under time pressure. So it's similar. And look, who isn't interested in stories of, danger, rescue, survival? Think of books like the I Survived books, which are so popular. It's a kind of experience that catches, and the world was riveted by the story of the boys in the cave. So I like writing about that sort of thing, but it was most similar to Trapped. My interests are quite broad. My doctorate's in American history. I've done a bunch of books that have to do with human evolution. I have to tell you guys this. So I wrote a book called The Skull in the Rock, which was I did with an American paleoanthropologist named Lee Berger, who made a discovery about a possible human ancestor that had previously never been found, Australopithecus sediba. He lives in South Africa. And a few years ago, his team made another discovery, which is called Homo naledi. Homo naledi is the bones are found deep in an extremely tight cave. So the only people who can go down there are scientists who are very well trained cavers, but also scientists, and very thin. And so he did a Twitter blast looking for these scientists, and he picked 6 of them. He calls them underground astronauts, and they have one thing in common, which is to say they're all women. And the leader of this group is this marvelous scientist named Dr. Marina Elliott. And she was interviewed about her work. And someone said, what is exploration? What is research? And she said, it's curiosity with a purpose. And I feel like that's everything I do, is curiosity with a purpose.
Huh. Oh.
I was going to say, I just wanted to follow up on something you mentioned about the international collaboration. What did you think it was that motivated these various, I don't know, countries, if you will, to come together?
Well, that's a good question. I mean, on the one hand, I think the fact that there were 12 boys and their coach who were missing, touched people, inspired people. I think there was genuine human interest. And also where the boys were, they were in a cave that in the dry season school groups go to. You can walk in and out, etc. However, it's made out of limestone, and limestone is very porous. So when the rains come, even though under other conditions it would be easy to traverse, once the rains come, it fills up totally. And that meant that if the boys either were to be rescued or if their bodies were to be found, it would involve the skills of cave divers. And cave divers are a very, very highly specialized crew. And so many of the people who volunteered were cave divers. And they're from all over the world. However, so I think there was pure volunteerism, there was concern and caring, there was the need for cave diving skills, but it was also a media opportunity. It was also, once the game was afoot, at a certain point there were 10,000 people at the cave, which included 1,500 media people. So I think people, entities started to feel like, well, we need to be there. Everybody else is there. We need to be there. And this presence of so many people actually was a disaster. It almost made the rescue not work because there were too many hands in the till, so to speak. So I would mostly say it was good-hearted volunteerism. But I do think the presence of the media and the media attention also drew attention.
Yeah, I was going to say there was also one scene in the book that you mentioned where the local police chief or one of the police chiefs tried to make everything go through him, I guess.
Yeah, he wanted to be the guy in charge, and everybody to kind of come to him for, think any disaster. Think of Sandy, think of Katrina, think of Houston, think of Puerto Rico, is immediately political, right? The government will be judged on how it responded, and the government chooses how to respond to its particular disaster. The Thai government is a military dictatorship that is unpopular. It also has a king who, oddly enough, lives most of the time in Munich for reasons that no one really knows. So you had a government that was heading towards an election that it wanted to make sure to control with a distant king. This rescue, from the government's point of view, had to go well. But that also meant they couldn't say no to anybody who was volunteering to bring something. They didn't really have control of the site. And so a local officer could kind of swagger around and say, I'm in charge. And so the prime minister had to come and, play chess and say, no, you thought you were in control, but I'm in control. So, but that's like, as again, any circumstance which is both perilous, but has a kind of political, national media overtone, the sort of who's in charge here question arises.
One last question before we wrap
Sure.
up this segment. So there are often authors who may visit a location to be inspired with writing their story. Do you have any inspiration to go to Thailand?
Oh, I would love to go to Thailand. I had to interview a lot of people to understand the cave. But so what happened was we were in Europe, but there are certain countries where you can't go there if your passport is going to expire within the next 6 months. So that was true of my passport. So the minute we got home, I did like super rush new passport in case I could get to go to Thailand. But I didn't have time to go there, and actually it would have been a detriment because I was gathering so much information. I needed to be in my hub. But I would love to go. I would love to go into the cave.
Well, speaking of expiration, I think we're going to have to take a break. So if you'll bear with us, we'll be back in a minute.
It's an onion.
Hi, and welcome back to Books in Action. This is Larry Petraccaro with Keisha Miller and Marc Aronson. And we've been talking about Rising Water, which is the latest book that Marc has written about the Thai cave rescue. And in the previous segment, we were talking a little bit about the volunteerism. You mentioned you thought there was a lot of pure volunteerism. But you also mentioned two things that kind of caught my attention. One was the role that China played, which is probably something that we haven't really heard here. And the other was, you said the U.S. military provided a pretty appropriate and helpful organization. And in the book, you mentioned that the Thai government seemed to know what their limitations were, which sort of surprised me that they didn't try to do the whole thing.
No, the Thai government is very close to the U.S. and in particular to the U.S. military. There's decades of cooperation, so they certainly had channels of communication, and they knew they needed help. And they knew, and the U.S. I was very impressed with. We read about military things you may favor or not favor, military actions, but they have really spent a lot of time figuring out how to cooperate with other countries and other cultures. They study actually how to communicate not just across language but across culture. And they have a lot of experience with functioning in difficult terrain. And so they really had very strong managerial understandings of how do you manage a circumstance like this. There was a great moment actually after the first day of rescue. Major Hodges, who was leading the group, called everyone together, and it felt to me like a manager on the second day of the World Series after you won the first game, and going over everything with the team to sort of say, we can't get complacent. What did we do wrong? How could we do better tomorrow? And you really saw that skill. I think the Thai government, to its credit, did understand that it needed help and that pride was less important than trying to have a good outcome. And again, they had long history of working with the U.S., so it wasn't like, a jump out of nothing. About China, there were two groups there, and what I even just learned is they were both volunteer groups. China now has reached the stage where there are wealthy philanthropists within China who sponsor volunteer groups who do good works around the world. And so one of these groups, they were actually in Zimbabwe protecting animals from poachers. When they got word of the boys in the caves, and they had certain physical skills, and so they decided to go to Thailand. And they were worried, how would they be viewed? They weren't, would there be tensions with the Americans? They weren't military, but they were appreciated for their skills and very effective in how they functioned. And I think it's one thing important for us to realize: China is a global actor. And that's not just those who are fearful of rising China or the power of the Chinese economy. They are a global power that seeks to function in the world as we do. And we need to recognize them as peers in functioning in the world, who has that sense of responsibility, that they have skills and people and money, but also interest, that if something happens in the world, they want to be part of it. They want to be recognized for that, and that's an important thing to know.
So, when you were writing this book, who was your intended audience?
That's a good question. My intended audience, I think, for this book was sort of, I would say, middle grade into high school. I knew that I was finding things out that no adult publication had yet covered, and so I think there will be adults who will find it interesting. But, I have written now over 20 books, or written or co-authored, and I think when you've written a lot of books for any group, but in my case, often for middle grade or high school, you develop an almost physical sense of how long a chapter should be, of how you break up your story into parts. I liken it to a songwriter who knows how long a song should be. It's a feel. What's A, what's B, what's A, to get that emotion across. And I feel like I know how to do that for middle grade. I know where, and middle grade is blurry. There are upper elementary people who can read it, and there are high school people who can read it. But that's where I was going. It's for that reader who has a little bit of time to read and a curiosity.
You know, it's funny, I think you were reading my mind here. I liked how you outlined the chapters. You know, it wasn't just chapter 6.
Right.
And, you know, a title that we're used to seeing in nonfiction books, detailing exactly what happened. This was written in a story format.
Right.
It was a page turner, literally.
That was my goal, and I think, again, look, more and more nonfiction for middle grade and up is, as is called, narrative nonfiction,
Mm-hmm.
and that is, here's the point. You're not reading it because you have to. You're not reading it because you've been assigned to do a report about it, of a book of over 100 pages, or whatever the rule may be. You're reading it because you're interested in it.
Exactly.
And that puts a weight on the author because you don't have to be there. You're there because the book offers you something that makes it worth it for you to be there.
That is very true. So if you don't mind, I'd like to go into a little bit, since we're on the topic of
Sure.
nonfiction. What is your definition of nonfiction?
Oh,
Let's
that's a
just
great
start there.
question. I think nonfiction, well, two things. It has an obligation never to say anything that it knows to be false.
Mhm.
And secondly, nonfiction can speculate. You can say it could be, or we can picture that, but you have to make clear to the reader when you're leaving what you know and when you are entering into, I think it could be this way. Those are two separate things. But the other crucial thing about nonfiction means you've based what you've said on some level of research. You've found this information. You are obliged to tell the reader how you know what you know. The reader has no reason to believe something is true because you say it's true. Your obligation is to show how come you think it's true. Where did you find this out? Is there other evidence? You have to give the reader access to how you learned this. And one of the reasons I say this, we talk so much now about information literacy and helping people to make sense of how they're being battered by all the flows of claims and fake news and all of this. Nonfiction is always modeling that process, not of truth, but of the search for truth. That you're abiding by certain rules. The rules are, I'll never lie to you. I'll tell you when I'm leaving what I know into what I think, and I'll tell you how I found it out. I will play by those rules. Therefore, I encourage you to play by those rules, and I encourage you, when you're examining what the world tells you, to ask of the world that it do the same. How do you know? Where does it come from? Are there other points of view? What is your thought, and what is research that you've done?
I really, in reading this book, I kind of took myself back to, 5th, 6th, even 7th grade, and I think we've all had that project, that social studies project, write about this country and, a current event that has happened. But I really foresee this book, Rising Water being something included in a lesson plan where it's going to be talked about and discussed. It's not just it is an event that happened, but it isn't a current event for some kids where they're like, oh, just read the article and this is what happened, the end. I think they'll really read this from, start to finish and learn something about the personality of the boys, the responsibility that it takes. And that, I think, is important when you're reading anything, but specifically nonfiction, because I think nonfiction can sometimes have a bad rap in being it's just books about animals or books about, locomotives or something. And so kids, I don't want to say kids don't want to learn. They do. But they want to learn a little bit something more beyond the facts. And I think this really provides that. So.
Well, thanks. I will tell you, often authors ask, when their book is coming out, someone to do a teacher's guide so teachers can teach it. But I instead asked one of the researchers who worked with me on the book to create a research guide so that teachers could use the book as a model to teach young people how to do research. Because I want them to follow their curiosity with a purpose and find out what interests them in the world. And so I can model that. I know how to research something. Now you go research something that stimulates you.
What are some of the books in this genre, nonfiction, as we talk about it, that you can compare Rising Water to?
Oh, that's a great question. I mean, I would say again, I mentioned I Survived, although those are actually fiction. Mm-hmm. And then there is a parallel series called Lost, which is nonfiction about various people who were lost in one way or another. So that's one area. Obviously I think a lot of people really admire Steve Shankin, and I do, for his narrative skill. So many of his books. I've done a bunch of books recently co-edited with Susan Campbell Bartoletti, and I really like her books. Candace Fleming does some wonderful things with structure in her nonfiction books. She did a wonderful book called Amelia Lost, which alternating chapters were Amelia Earhart's flight out and the effort to figure out what became of her. So she created this kind of V which came together, and so there's a lot of experiment going on in nonfiction, in how we're writing. We're sort of freed up. Something I want to do someday is graphic novel nonfiction. We're playing. We're doing a lot of new and exciting things. So I really like what my fellow authors are doing.
Any thoughts on perhaps making an audiobook?
There is an audiobook, and that was really interesting. So there is an audiobook, and they sent around some various, I asked could I hear the voices of the candidates, and they were all fine. And then I hunted, and I found a person to do it. His name is Vikas Adam. He did Life of Pi. And though he's Indian, not Thai, he did a spectacular job of learning how to pronounce the Thai names, because I didn't want the book to, I wanted the book to sound in a way not like me. I wanted it to have some sense of place. And so I was so glad when Vikas Adam agreed to do the book. So we definitely have it in audio.
Thank you.
Well, I think we're just about out of time.
Sure.
I had another question, but I think we've got so little time we're going to have to forgo it. So maybe I'll ask it to you when we're off the air.
Sure.
But thank you all for joining us on Books in Action. This is Larry Petraccaro with Keisha Miller and Marc Aronson.